since this is kind of an empty house, the first 5 or 6 rows, can I ask everyone in the back half of the room to move up and fill the first 4 or 5 rows? And I really mean it, everyone. 4 rows. Great, thank you. So I'm going to show you a selection of projects fairly recent of the last few years. And they have a few things in common. I'm very interested in learning things. It's kind of become a compulsion of sorts the last few years. I'll show you this picture. When I first joined the Mycological Society of Toronto, which is the mushroom hunting club in Toronto, I thought it was kind of funny. I felt like I was doing it half as a joke. People obsessed with collecting mushrooms. And I started when I first went to forays taking pictures of mushroomers because I thought they were kind of funny, like obsessed with these brown, sometimes little turds, rotting things. And it didn't take long, like after a few forays, for me to become one of these guys and really preoccupied with mushrooms myself. And then I just took close-up pictures of deadly things and marvelously colored things and mushrooms with strange names, etc. And so for many years I would sort of study things that were unlike art and think of them as a kind of break from art or a departure from my everyday work. And what ended up happening inevitably is that I'm still an artist when I'm there, and I can't help but bring my own strategies, ways of knowing and learning, and ways of thinking about things to this practice. And inevitably these practices became research for artworks. So I'll show you a few examples of how I've collaborated with naturalists and different kinds of community organizations and made artworks as events, social projects, things in the world, responding to different contexts, including in museums and galleries, and responding to those sites as a specific context as well. So this is what mushroomers do on Sunday mornings. They go in the woods, everyone fans out and collects species, anything that you find, and then you bring them all back together and you lay them out on a gigantic table, and some of the senior and more experienced mushroomers will identify things for you. It's a very old practice. It goes back to Victorian naturalists. It's called a foray. And I really enjoyed this activity and I got a lot out of it. Once I was really deeply into and obsessed with mushrooms and going on forays as this like peaceful and interesting activity. I was stuck in the rain on my bike in Chinatown in Toronto, and I realized in one of the little medicinal shops that it was full of mushroom species. I mean, things that I thought were mushroom species, some things I wasn't even sure, and I couldn't communicate with the staff very well. And I got to thinking about this, like how many species are there in Chinatown in Toronto? Wouldn't it be cool if I could get the whole Mycological Society to come and we could do a foray in Chinatown? And so what I did was I proposed to the Toronto Mycological Society, what do you think of a foray in the city, like in the shops? And a lot of the members of the Mycological Society are Chinese and said, oh no, Chinatown in Toronto is for tourists. We have to go to Markham. They were really into this idea. And so what we did was we had one of our Sunday morning forays, not in the forest, but in the shopping malls and the supermarkets. And what we did is we went to medicinal shops, we had our field guides and our magnifying glasses, like this is the whole Mycological Society, walking around the supermarket in Markham and identifying species in the canned goods section. And it was really interesting because our field guides about mushrooms of Ontario and Eastern Canada was really incomplete when we were in Markham, right? There were all kinds of species that weren't in our books. There were species that were in our books, but it says that they were inedible, but they were for sale, as tea or as food in medicinal shops or in the supermarket. And it was kind of interesting for us to do our usual activity just in this radically different scenario. I love this picture. The gentleman on the left, he was a retired botany professor from the University of Toronto, and he used to carry his oxygen tank every weekend through the forest. He just liked this activity so much. It was sort of a heroic thing. And this is a project I call the Chinatown Foray. I actually got to do it again in New York City. And I did it with, when you're in New York City, it's amazing, we went into the Chinese markets, Japanese markets, Korean, Eastern European, Italian markets, and found lots and lots of mushroom species. I think I have a list here we had something like 37 species of mushrooms we found in New York City. And we kind of did the same thing that we usually do with the society. We debate the names, we translate them. Some of the participants were really good at cooking, stinkhorns and cloud fungi and various unusual things. And so we went with the New York Mycological Society and with the Toronto Mycological Society. After the activity, we went for dim sum and did our identification. And here, in New York City, it's amazing. We did this with Gary Linkoff, who's like a mushroom rock star. He wrote the National Audubon. And the New York Mycological Society loved doing a foray in the city in the winter so much they told me they wanted to make it a biannual event. And we found parasitic fungi in caterpillars, for eating, cauliflower mushrooms, hedgehogs. Gary Linkoff told us stories, over dim sum about feeding Margaret Thatcher stinkhorns and crazy things like that. It was pretty amazing. And interesting, too, to think about a globalized field for these species and how these practices are complicated by doing it, instead of shopping. I make a lot of these kinds of projects in the world, and there's their events, and then they take form as, they kind of come back to the art world in different ways. I talk about them like this. Sometimes images and descriptions are in publications. Sometimes I also print photographs with text for gallery exhibitions. They kind of emerge in all different forms that change, but they do end up sort of back home in an art context eventually. So here's one more project I made in collaboration with the Mycological Society, but in this case, it was a project with the Vancouver Mycological Society and the Vancouver Astronomical Society. So these are the Astronomy Amateurs. And this was a group of 50 people on a night that was clear, if you can imagine that, just outside of Vancouver in Maple Ridge, BC. And the project was called Terrestrial Celestial. And so what it involved was I invited the two organizations to come together. In the morning, or sort of lunchtime, we had the mycologists host the astronomers to gain terrestrial knowledge. We looked down. And then at night, the astronomers hosted the mushroomers for celestial knowledge. So we had a kind of looking down Earth and sky in one day. So here are the astronomer. And so each group kind of took turns being teachers and students as well. And what was really interesting about terrestrial celestial was how it really reflected two quite radically different ways of knowing, not just earth and sky and up and down. It occurred to me, because I was more on the mushroom side, that mycology is really visceral, right? It sort of relies on your immediate senses. It's proximal. You put your subject in your hand, it's sort of sticky and decaying and dissolving, within an hour or even in your basket. And astronomy, on the other hand, which I had a much harder time relating to, I realized was this really intellectual way of knowing. You were asked to imagine how far back in time you were seeing, and it's at this scale of time scale, a distance scale that's so inconceivable. It's a real feat of imagination. And so, even though both practices are sort of much assisted by a range of technical devices, microscopes and telescopes, it was amazing just to kind of have two teachers and to take turns in each other's worlds, finding those things in common and then those things that were just completely remote from each other. And I like this picture because it has hardcore mushroomer, hardcore astronomer side by side with their club t-shirts. It's exactly right there, terrestrial, celestial. And just incredible to plan an astronomy project in Vancouver, when it rains all the time. And we had a clear night. It was really amazing. It was funny too to see the astronomers all kind of out of their element in the forest. They had binoculars, which is in the forest, and they had big Tupperware containers that were really awkward to carry around, and the mushroomers all complaining about being up so late. And I think of them too, it was kind of two nerd cohorts, it was kind of the mushroomer West Coast guys who were sort of hippie, and then the astronomers were kind of engineer nerds with nice fancy cars and stuff. It was really interesting in one day, just sort of the two groups side by side. And so in my works, I do think about, people, contexts, ideas. These are all sort of elements in a composition. It's in one day, mycology, astronomy, and just kind of putting them in those positions for an experience that I don't entirely know what will happen is my work. So here's an image from another project called Italian Lessons, and this was something that I was thinking about for a long time. My family's Italian, and I don't speak Italian very well. I've never really been very successful with conventional language lessons and trying to learn in the ordinary ways. And I always find them kind of boring, doing grammar drills and having, meaningless conversations. And so I kind of thought, well, why don't I just merge this with all the things I am interested in? Maybe I could learn Italian if I do it by talking about and learning other stuff that I'm really curious about. And so what I did was I attempted to practice various things I was interested in. So among them, I had a physics student, a graduate student in physics, explain to me his research on primordial black holes entirely in Italian. It seemed interesting to me. I don't know anything about physics in English. And I had a lesson in physics in Italian, struggling and learning specialized vocabulary in his field. And another thing I really wanted to learn at that time was beekeeping. And so learning beekeeping in Italian was a very special, kind of more significant project. I was very curious about this practice. I didn't know anything about it in English as well, all the specialized vocabulary, learning to say things like, drones and swarms and brood and varroa mites, and talking about feeding and mating and pest control and harvesting honey and things like that. And so what I did was I had to find a place in Italy where beekeepers didn't speak English. This was the plan. I needed people who could not speak English who would teach me about beekeeping and introduce me to beekeeping strictly in Italian. And so I just sort of searched, a city in Italy famous for honey, and that happened to be on the flanks of the volcano of Mount Etna in Sicily. It was a city branded the City of Honey. And what I did was I went there and found some beekeepers who agreed to take me into their apiaries. And so I met an automechanic beekeeper and this apicoltore here, who was obsessed with raising queens. Different beekeepers told me all kinds of amazing stories. Like I had to study because I couldn't speak Italian very well, and I was putting on a bee suit going into a hive for the first time. So I actually was really motivated to study beekeeping in Italian before I went and learn all the vocabulary so that I could communicate, so that I could ask questions, and so that I could be safe. And so it was amazing. This guy over here, his son was with me. His son was like 8 years old, and they told me that when he was born, before he tasted his mother's milk, that they put a finger of honey into his mouth. And I asked the kid, are you going to be a beekeeper? And he was like, yeah, probably. It was pretty amazing. And it kind of gave me something at stake. I would be in trouble communicating and possibly in danger if I didn't know my Italian beekeeping vocabulary. And the great thing is it enabled me to talk about so many other things because of that specialized vocabulary that have so much to do with life. I did do a performance about a year after the sort of beekeeping in Italy practice where I talked about keeping bees in Italian, and it was very much about seeing how far I could go with this vocabulary and talk about, sex and dancing and the monarchy and everything else that is available when you know this one particular specialized language. So beekeeping is something that I continued learning when I came back to Canada and studied in Toronto with various beekeeping organizations. I was the artist in residence at the AGO a couple of years ago, and I had in mind making this really big project with a lot of beekeepers. It turns out that a lot of artists have made wonderful works that I love very much with bees and with honeycomb, for example. I was kind of interested in making an artwork with beekeepers because I found beekeepers to be a fascinating characters with very special kinds of knowledge and very special abilities. And one thing that I was especially interested in was this kind of reciprocity that beekeepers have, like really good, experienced senior beekeepers are really calm, right? And they can open a hive and they can be calm. And there are 100,000 stinging insects who are not always that happy that you've opened their nest and are sticking your tools and your arms into their nest. But I was very moved practicing sometimes with very senior, experienced practitioners, and they could really show this beautiful effect of like their comportment, their temperament, how much it affected the bees and vice versa, and you can keep the bees calm. This doesn't always work, and you still have to smoke them, and don't try this at home. But it was something I was thinking about a lot, how one person's like temper and manner affects other beings outside of you, and something really vividly illustrated by being among bees. And it's a very unique situation. And so what I made thinking about this was a series of videos called apiary videos. And I got into the urban apiaries of a whole bunch of different beekeepers in the Toronto area, and I asked them if they would just demonstrate this special power of beekeepers to be calm and to be still, and not really much more than that. And the beekeepers just got it implicitly, you know. Whenever I work with amateur naturalists, I found it like really easy to say, yeah, I'm an artist and I'm doing, they don't really care. I mainly ask them to do things that they already do, and so this wasn't really a feat. And so I'll show you a little clip of this series of videos. So it's just a series of videos of different beekeepers in their apiaries being still and just transmitting this stillness, you know, around them. I'll just show maybe 2 minutes of this. I think you get the idea. I don't know if any of you have been in an apiary before. It's a pretty special thing to access, and my work, I feel like, really comes a lot out of like sort of years of research and practice and developing these somewhat trusting relationships in order to have access to do these things. And apiary videos I made also to some extent as research and preparation for a large performance that I wanted to make at the AGO. And here's an image from that performance. And this was, I would say, the largest performance or situation I'd ever concocted in my life. And I told my family never to let me do anything times 100 ever again. It's a piece called Your Temper, My Weather. And so this piece consisted of 100 regional beekeepers performing something that looked like a kind of collective meditation. It's interesting, you know, I was just in Banff with Gabriella at a residency on stillness, and it was really nice to talk about this piece in this context to artists and practitioners who are really thinking about stillness as a subject and as a theme in their work and as something to cultivate in their life for various reasons. And you know, it's a very long-winded, kind of complicated way to get to something as simple as and obvious as meditation, because that's kind of what it looks like, being present and being calm and thinking about the implications of that, sort of how that reverberates. So this was kind of like a meditation, and also kind of like a sit-in, if you imagine 100 beekeepers in AGO's main Walker Court. And for me, I thought of it as a kind of experiment. You know, I thought if one body can sort of calm, 50,000 bees, and if, like, my partner, for example, in the house in a bad mood, can feel like, bad air in the whole house and affect everybody else in the house. Like, we know that our tempers are the air around us, affecting everybody else. I wondered how powerful it would be if I multiplied that by 100. What if 100 of these practitioners were performing that special ability they have of literally like changing the beings around them with their stillness? And so it was kind of like realizing that experiment and seeing what would happen. Of course, it's called Your Temper, My Weather. Inevitably, it's also about environmental conditions that we're all concerned about right now. And as a sort of sit-in and a protest, even though we weren't saying anything, it was quite intense to see the commitment to 100 beekeepers. This was for 5 hours during Nuit Blanche. So I'm going to try and play the video. I should say I did have one meditation instructor, because asking people to sit for 5 hours or approximately meditating for 5 hours is actually a real feat. It does take some experience and it's quite intense. And so I did have someone sort of supporting us, with intervals and breaks, and we had also slow walking to break up all the sitting. And it was quite an intense experience. And 2 of the beekeepers were also meditation instructors, and so they volunteered to also lead some of the periods of meditating. And one of them led us with some humming, and of course, inevitably, we sounded like bees, But what was amazing was, and when you make projects like this, you can't entirely control all these elements. You kind of, we have collaborators and participants, and let things kind of unfold. The humming was so effective. 100 people vibrating like that. Literally, it felt like, this marble hall was vibrating. The walls were vibrating, the audience was vibrating. I felt really happy that I accomplished something I was trying to do, was make a Nuit Blanche big spectacle that was quiet, like that was calm. which was a fun challenge to sort of realize, because the audience was incredibly sort of quiet and respectful. I think you could sort of feel the intensity of all this commitment. So that was in Louis Blanche in Toronto in 2013. And I have to say, the AGO, because this was produced while I was in residence there, was so amazing at supporting this project. And I think I never could have made it if it weren't for that institutional sort of weight and support, you know, to ask non-artists to make performance art with you for 5 hours in a bee suit is a lot to ask. And the AGO was so supportive and so significant in making that possible, which I was really grateful for. So I tend to, in my work, kind of make big, sprawling, messy, lots of people involved, you know, months and months of emailing and schmoozing beekeepers. And then I made this much smaller piece where I proposed to the AGO that we drink tea out of cups in the collection. And anyone with any knowledge of museum conservation, you know, is gasping, because I was joking, you know, at one of the many, many meetings that we had about this proposal to drink tea out of cups in the collection, that it was like the most impossible cup of tea in Toronto that was being proposed. And after many more of these meetings and many of the museum, you know, chain of command saying no, it became the most dangerous cup of tea in Toronto, which was really amusing to me to see how far I could kind of press at some of the conventions and the boundaries at play in the museum. Eventually, I did get permission to do this, and what I wanted to do was, these were sort of early 19th century bone china teacups of like middling quality, they were described as, and they were part of the Grange collection, which already is a kind of marginal collection in the museum. What ended up happening because of this proposal was like really kind of taking these objects and a lot of people weighing in on what they were and how important they were, and relative to everything else in the museum, sort of what was at stake to realize this contemporary artwork versus the risk of handling this object. And eventually I had permission for myself, with a group of conservators, a registrar, an interpretive planner, and a curator, and a critic, to drink out of these cups together in the conservation lab, which is a great place. So the conservators, I call this piece tea service, conservators will wash the dishes, which I loved because they weren't dishes, right? They were museum artifacts. And so the conservators had to prepare them and evaluate them and clean them, and they gave us very strict instructions about how to handle them and use them. And we had tea together. See, everyone's happy now. When we finally got there, it was a pleasant, although stiff and careful activity. And we had 3 kinds of tea. We had a very nice white tea from China, a good Taiwanese oolong, and a very old pu'er tea. And so before and after, the conservators washed the dishes. And actually, one of the conservators wrote a blog post, you know, again, how do these pieces kind of exist outside of this little scenario? Wrote a blog post about the activity, like from a conservator's point of view. It was interesting, though, around the table, because everyone had different kinds of knowledge about the cups. You know, a critic who specializes in writing about art and the senses, and, you know, someone who was the curator of the Grange collection, and someone who was an expert at conserving these materials. And so the conversation, kind of this activity became a very intensive and sort of cross-disciplinary way of knowing these cups, as well as getting to put them in our mouth, which is what you're supposed to do with a cup, right? And so I feel like in some ways, obviously this is not a proposal to like open all the vitrines and go wild. I feel in some ways as an artist, it's a kind of privilege we might have, this access. And since I have it and I can get away with it, to sort of be ambassadors for everybody else and use it and act out some of these kind of mischievous fantasies or experiences that not everyone can have. So for me, when I'm compelled to make an artwork in a museum or in an art gallery, sometimes I go into a kind of panic, you know. I've tried many times in my life having an art studio, like an empty white room, and I don't know what to do in there other than like write my grant proposals and check my emails, and I feel really squirrely, like I kind of need site, a scenario to respond to. I need stuff. I need people. It's not always a rule, but that's been an ongoing practice in my work. So when I do make a work in a museum, like the tea service piece, the museum itself is a subject in the piece. Whether it's about museum conservation or a history of art or just being in this kind of context, whatever it is, really becomes an important part of the work. And these are 6 very innocent-looking, handsomely dressed contemporary dancers, dressed like ordinary, elegant party guests. And I commissioned them to sort of infiltrate a benefit gala party at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Well, I was commissioned to make a piece, and what I did was this project called Falling Piece. And so what I did was the dancers had to fall. Each of them had to fall many times throughout this fancy party with like 2,000 well-dressed, tipsy attendees. And so the performers were meant to look as if they just kind of lost their balance and not to look like they're drunk. I wanted to actually give the general impression that the museum was somehow like dangerously slippery or unstable. And so if you're at a party and you see a couple, somebody slip, it's quite embarrassing, in high heels. And then you see somebody else a little later fall down the stairs, and then you see someone else. So there were over 100 of these kind of staged falls. And these dancers are really good at falling. Like, this is something they are virtuosos at. Like, I put them up to this, and I was constantly worried that they fell for real. I was constantly worried they were injured. They would, the AGO had recently been renovated, and so they were really having fun exploring new aspects of the architecture by hurtling themselves, like, all over the museum. And, the security, the guy in brown, the security was totally briefed about this activity. They knew that performers would be falling all through the evening, and even still, they were always there helping people. I had one security guard turn to me because I was nearby and say, "Oh my God, I thought that was one of those actors." And of course, it was one of the dancers for the falling piece. And I love this picture too because this lady has 2 drinks and she's trying to decide what to do. Yeah, he fell in the revolving door. So I like this idea that you might sort of subconsciously get this sort of queasy feeling, like what is going on? Like checking, your own balance. Like, how is it the museum is not as stable and safe as I thought? And for me, a sort of mischievous, critical way to upset maybe the authority of that place. When you're an artist who does anything kind of alive or performance-like, you're often asked to make projects for parties. I teach at the University of Guelph, and I do a whole assignment for my 4th-year students making live art pieces called party art. And we talk a lot about sort of how you solve the context of a party. Nobody wants to be told to be quiet and clear and watch the art. You have to kind of intervene somehow, sneak in, disrupt, and not entertain. That's just not enough. It still somehow has to be kind of critical or responsive in some more complicated way than entertaining at parties. One hopes. So this is a piece that I made based on instructions from the Critical Art Ensemble. A curator had asked me to respond to these instructions to commit a crime with a humanitarian outcome. And what I did was I stole flowers from my neighbor's gardens, which is a very bad thing to do. It was very hard for me to do it. I stole just like one minor thing not only because I love flowers so much. I was like, okay, I'm going to act out this horrible, mischievous hunger, to steal these beautiful things. I tried to make nothing even visible. It was like so insignificant. And I made a little bouquet and I gave it to my mother. And I told her where it came from, and she was still delighted. And after I did this project, I started doing a series of stolen bouquets. It occurred to me that as a sculptor, a still life kind of sculpture like this was kind of interesting if you identified on the materials list that they were stolen flowers. Mm-hmm. Suddenly the whole thing looks different, it has a different kind of aura, a lot more mischievous. And I kind of liked the challenge that the piece posed, to make something beautiful, ephemeral and beautiful. Is it worth the tiny crime? for me, it was something interesting to kind of weigh out with the piece. And I did make a series of bouquets for all kinds of different exhibitions and contexts of stolen flowers. And so this picture on the right was from another sort of fundraising gala thing that I was invited to participate in at the power plant called the Power Ball. And I went to the wealthy neighborhoods in Toronto and some of the corporate gardens and took flowers from there to decorate for the party. And I mean, there's a fraught feeling that artists have sometimes with the patrons of the arts. And so these kinds of galas and fundraisers sometimes bring up some of that tension. And I think I wanted to just explore that a bit by stealing potentially from the gardens of the people who were there celebrating at the party to entertain them. A very bad activity that I cannot bear to do anymore, but it was for art. And in response to making that activity, I've given back, given back to the world. This is just an image I found on the internet of snowdrops growing in the spring. I think this is in the UK. Just so you would have a sense of what snowdrops are. Snowdrops are these little bulb flowers. Some of you probably know what they are. They're the very, very, very first flowers usually that bloom before the snow is even gone. So the tiny little white blooms, with a little turned head. I had to make a piece for Calgary Nuit Blanche, and I was so conflicted, having such a hard time again working at a party, and what could I do? Sort of from Toronto when I just get to show up for a couple of days. And so I thought of making this piece where I would give away thousands and thousands and thousands of snowdrop bulbs. And I ended up with all my budget and grants and everything being able to afford 20,000 snowdrops that had to be brought in from Holland. In Calgary, because of the climate zone, snowdrops are just kind of at the edge of being viable there, and they're not already around very much because there isn't a tradition of growing them there. And because of global warming, though, it's likely snowdrops will flourish and multiply and succeed every year, coming back and expanding in Calgary. So ironically, what I wanted to do was give away thousands and thousands of snowdrops. I made a little artist multiple kind of tote bag with instructions in a kind of graphic design about how to properly plant and take care of them. I had a team of performers who, each person who got a bag of snowdrops was given explicit instructions, agreed to plant them and take care of them. So they were all distributed in the city of Calgary. I did get the following spring, this was in the fall, several photographs of people showing me how some of them at least have bloomed. And the ironic part of this project for me was that these are the first flowers that bloom at the end of winter, and they sort of naturalize well and they spread readily. So I liked the idea that this could kind of create this dispersed, city-wide snowdrop garden in the spring. Maybe it'll take a generation, but also that warming temperatures are kind of required for this project to succeed. And so it might remind you every winter, at the end of winter, depending on how early they come up, sort of be a kind of sign of changing temperatures, changing seasons. And a kind of quiet reminder, potentially forever, of these changing conditions. So I stole a few flowers, but gave as many back as I could. Just want to be clear. I have a fear, because I've shown this project many times, and I keep thinking that now I have a little garden, and I keep thinking an OCAD student will come and steal my flowers, as a kind of response piece, and I guess I'll have to submit, but I know you guys are far enough away, and you don't know where I live, so. Here's one more flower piece. It's nice, I was talking in the studio with Graham somewhere a little about flowers today, and it is something I've always been preoccupied with. When I was an undergrad, I worked at a florist for many years and have always kind of come back to and enjoying working with flowers in different ways. This piece involving 24 Gardenia flower boutonnieres. These are ready in the trunk of my car. And it's from a piece called Cloud. And I was invited to do a piece for the opening of a new gallery space that Jessica Bradley had in Toronto. And so this is kind of a fancy commercial gallery, and the performance artist is asked to make party art. And I'm always really kind of conflicted about it, and especially I hadn't really done something like that for a commercial scenario. I knew it was going to be a big, busy opening. I wrestled and toiled and tried to think of something that would kind of pass, but also have a subversive dimension. And I came up with this project that, again, was kind of like the realization of a fantasy. Gardenia Flowers, have you smelled a gardenia flower before? You can only imagine how my car smelled. Okay, one of these, when I was a florist, we would get like one, from Mexico for someone's wedding bouquet, and one would just like create intense perfume in the entire flower shop. Like, one is so overwhelming. So when I was working on these, I did have a little studio at the time. I thought of something to do in there, making these boutonnieres. I had people from like literally a city block away in this enormous industrial building going, what is going on in here? Like, the perfume was so, so intense. I thought of making a piece like that was about like too much beauty in a way. It's very beautiful, but this was so over the top. I had 24 people agree to wear a boutonniere for 1 hour during this kind of crowded exhibition. And so the volunteers kind of just mingled normally throughout the party. They were regular kind of art world people who would be at an opening. And this like incredible, extravagant, overwhelming scent just occupied the entire space. A friend there told me she thought it was an olfactory sculpture, which I loved, this feeling like the weight of this cloud of perfume. You can't see any of the artworks on the walls in this gallery. It was so crowded. But if you breathed, this piece was inevitable. Like, everybody kind of had to engage in this piece for 1 hour, after which time the performers with the flowers left the building. And so, again, I'm just sort of asking people to do what they normally do, just with one little twist. And I was happy with kind of the extravagance of it. Actually, 24 gardenia flowers, that was as many, it cost $1,000. So it was a 1 hour, $1,000, too much beauty kind of, you could taste it, and kind of an amazing thing to get to actually realize. So finally, I just thought I'd show a couple of images. This is a classmate of mine in a class practicing Sugetsu Ikebana. And I have been, as you see, I like to study various things. I still practice mushrooming. I realize when I want to learn things, I have to kind of keep practicing them in different ways, and I sometimes will lead mycological forays. I make my students do a mycological foray every year, and find different contexts in which to keep practicing these things. I still keep bees. I have 2 hives with my dad. And I also have studied tea quite extensively, which preceded the tea service piece, and still practice that in any way I can, if not just personally and with my friends, but sometimes leading workshops and things. I thought I would just show you something kind of messy and that I'm in the middle of, and that I don't entirely know how it's all going to culminate. For the past few years, I've been studying Sugetsu Ikebana, and this is a practice. It's a fairly modern school of Japanese flower arranging, and it's invented by a practitioner called Sofu Teshigahara. And it involves using all kinds of materials. I think the motto is, anything, anywhere, anyone, except it's a traditional craft practice with all kinds of outrageous and strict rules. And so, many of my practices, I'm kind of interested in natural science and things like that, but this is a more aesthetic one. And I've been struggling and wrestling, and I'm also interested in this as a mode of learning. I have a strict textbook. I follow like one lesson after another with tiny increments of change and lots of repetition. I feel like I went to art school, much like, I don't know, many of you might feel this way too, where it was sort of out of fashion to learn a hard skill of like really how to make something. And no matter what I do, I always feel sort of nervous that maybe I don't know how to make anything very well. And so I had this idea, I would take flower arranging and I would learn how to make really good something, some kind of sculpture. I'd have one skill. until I met my first teacher, and she literally shook my hand and said, "So, will you do this for the rest of your life?" And realizing the commitment in order to actually be good at something is quite steep. And for me, as like with some of the the beekeeping project, the practitioners themselves, the teachers, this mode of learning is kind of becoming a subject for me. I've been trying to practice and bring some of these skills to art galleries. These are a couple of impromptu and very amateur, and I would never show them to my Ikebana teachers, sculptures I made with things around the Museum of Contemporary Canadian Art. These are arrangements I made in collaboration with artists who are much better at this stuff than I am. Terraria, which is a collective based in Toronto with Olya Mashenko, Emily Hogg, and Janice Stemke. And this was an exhibition at the Barnacky Gallery at U of T, and we had like vegetables, and they have all these incredible collections, and we jammed with some of my Ikebana sort of tropes and some of their mischievous interventions. So they collect all these incredible objects and make sculptures, and it was such a joy to try and use some Ikebana skills in this context because of their playful, fearless way of working, which I wish I could absorb, because they make my arrangements look great, or they do for sure. Here's some more from that exhibition. And I'm just showing you these because I don't know where this ends or if it's interesting yet. I'm just trying to keep practicing, keep learning, see if I can reconcile this practice somehow with contemporary art and contemporary art galleries. Here's another one. I have an exhibition at the Contemporary Art Gallery in Vancouver in the spring. I spent a few July there this past summer, and I met Ikebana practitioners in Vancouver. These are Ikebana practitioners in Vancouver. And a few of them have agreed to work with me on an installation at the CAG. So I'll be working with masters who are much, much, much better at this than I am. And I'm just interested in trying to in some ways, like bridge the contemporary art space of the white gallery and the crates and the stuff in the storage room and the weird modern furniture with tropes of Sugetsu Ikebana, which does involve everyday materials and objects, and see if I can kind of reconcile these worlds in like an impromptu one-night exhibition installation. And the project's called The Moon is often referred to as a dead, barren world, but I think this is not necessarily the case. And that's actually a line from Teshi Gahara's Book of Flowers, where he imagines making flower arrangements in any context, like even the moon. And so art gallery, empty, kind of reminds me of that. So this is just, I'm showing you practice and research and stuff because this is kind of how these projects are developed over years of study and participation. I was practicing my basic, my book one basic arrangements forever and ever and ever. I was making little versions of the angles in Vancouver. So I don't know if I'll show this as a photograph or if this is just, I'm showing you in progress. I also just wanted to show you my Ikebana teacher in Toronto. She would be so mad if she knew I was showing. My Ikebana teacher in Toronto has been really inspiring and influential. She's a retired Austrian psychiatrist. This is her vanity license plate that her teacher bequeathed to her in his will. And she is really super intense. When I met her and I wanted to have private lessons, she sat me in her living room and asked me, like she interviewed me for a good hour and a half. Like she's a psychiatrist, right? She was like, "What is your favorite book?" She said, "Which musical instruments do you play?" It was terrifying, it was terrible. And she still terrifies me. It's still something that I can't believe I subject myself to this abuse regularly. She tells me, I'm an art professor, right? She tells me, you don't know anything. This is how our lessons proceed. And she's right, because of course she's practiced this for decades, and in this arena, I'm in kindergarten. And I keep taking these pictures. She doesn't entirely realize. She hides behind the black, and I can't resist. This may be a photographic series as often as I can get her to do this for me with her manicure and her awesome hair, and she's like a dominatrix of Ikebana. And I love her more than the flowers, right? I realize that she will probably be the subject of a piece as soon as I can convince her to be in a video. And I've been working on it literally for about 2 years now, just building that relationship. I mean, I'm serious about the practice and I'm learning, and but she's kind of an irresistible subject that we'll see if I can. She may be my hardest yet. It's interesting too because when I met Ikebana practitioners in Vancouver, and I tried to explain a sort of gallery installation with them, like it has been so easy comparatively to work with mushroomers or beekeepers or astronomers. They don't really care about the artistic end of this. It's just not something they're invested in or that they know about, and so they're kind of agreeable. But these are artists, right? And so they have different ideas about art and how I'm planning to resolve these activities. And so I'm finding it incredibly hard to work with artists in this case, and I'm still trying to solve it. I just thought I would share that mess of possibilities with you guys. So that's all actually I'm going to show.